By the time Nora Quinn saw the child slip under the sale yard rail, the half-wild Mustang had already broken 2 lead ropes, bloodied one wrangler's mouth, and sent a grown man scrambling over the fence with half his shirt torn off. The little girl did not scream. She walked straight through the churned dust with a bruised apple in both hands and stopped 3 feet from the horse, as if danger were just another lonely thing that might soften if somebody came close enough without shouting. The Mustang came up hard, black mane flying, dark hide slick with sweat despite the cold morning. Men along the fence sucked in breath. The horse struck once, front hoof cracking against the packed earth. The sound rang through the yard. The girl lifted the apple. "Easy," she said, so quietly Nora almost did not hear it. "I know. I don't like mean people near my face either." The Mustang froze. Dust drifted through a bar of pale Wyoming sunlight. The horse lowered his head. He took the apple from the child's palm so gently he did not leave a tooth mark. Before we go farther, settle in wherever you are tonight and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We always like to know who's sitting by the fire with us. Now stay close, because that was the first time anybody in Bitter Flats had seen the black Mustang accept kindness without making somebody pay for it. Nora had come to town to buy winter oats and beg 3 more weeks on the note her late husband had left hanging over her ranch like a noose. She had not come looking for trouble. Trouble, however, had a way of finding women who knew too much about carrying things alone. She was 43, broad-shouldered, wind-browned, and known across 3 valleys for settling horses other people called ruined. She never bragged about it. She simply moved slower than fear expected and listened longer than most men had patience for. That morning she wore her dead husband's wool coat over her work dress, and there was still flour on one cuff from biscuits she had pulled from the stove before dawn. Now she dropped the grain list in the dirt and vaulted the fence before anyone could stop her. The horse had not moved. Neither had the child. Up close, Nora could see the girl was maybe 9 or 10, all elbows and grit. One boot had been resoled with a strip of harness leather. Her brown dress had been mended at least 4 times in 2 different thread colors. There was a fading bruise along her jaw and a smaller one near the wrist she kept half hidden in her sleeve. "Get her away from him," barked Boone Cutter from behind Nora. She turned and saw him on the top rail, one polished boot crossed over the other as if he had paid for the whole morning and intended to enjoy it. Boone Cutter owned the bank in Bitter Flats, the freight warehouse, the biggest cattle spread for 60 miles, and more of the town's fear than any one man had a right to hold. He was handsome in the cold way some knives were handsome. Clean collar, smooth voice, eyes like shuttered windows. The child did not look at him. She laid her hand on the Mustang's neck. The horse shivered once beneath her fingers and went still again. Nora said, "Whose girl is this?" Mrs. Tully, who kept county records and knew everybody's grief before they had finished making it, answered from the fence. "Elsie Wren, Samuel Wren's little one. Their cabin went up 2 weeks ago out by Willow Draw. Took both parents. She's been at the church house since." Boone Cutter smiled down into the pen. "And the horse belongs to me." The child looked up at that. "He does not." It was the first time her voice had any edge in it. Cutter's smile did not change, but Nora saw the annoyance behind it. "Your father owed me money. My father said you lie beautiful." The yard went dead quiet. Nora almost admired the courage of it, though courage in a child usually meant the world had already asked too much of her. Boone Cutter descended from the fence. "The horse ran half wild on my range after the fire. I had him taken up. The girl will be sent to the state home by week's end. Both matters are simple." Nothing in Cutter's tone suggested anything simple had ever been simple for the people standing in front of him. Nora looked at the Mustang again. His coat was black except for one crooked white mark under the throat. Old rope scars tracked one hind leg. Someone had handled him hard once and often. She knew that kind of animal. Not mean. Remembering. The horse nosed at Elsie's empty hand, looking for another piece of apple. The girl's face changed in the smallest way, some shudder inside her easing open a notch. Nora felt something move in her chest that she had kept walled for 12 years. She had lost a daughter once. Rose, 9 years old. Fever in January, too much snow on the pass for the doctor to come back in time. Since then, Nora had learned how to keep every corner of herself useful and none of it tender. She ran the ranch, buried her husband 4 winters later, paid his debts one calf at a time, and did not let herself stop long enough to remember what laughter sounded like in her own house. Now this little orphan girl stood in a dusty pen beside a horse nobody could tame, and Nora knew two things at once. The child had nowhere safe, and Boone Cutter wanted something more than a horse. That same hour, in the courthouse that smelled of lamp oil, wet wool, and old paper, Nora learned what. Elsie sat on a bench with her hands folded over a torn brown blanket. The Mustang waited in the stockyard below, stamping when strangers came too near. Judge Harlan Peake fumbled through probate papers, while Boone Cutter leaned one elbow on the clerk's table as if he had already purchased the outcome. "The Wren place borders my south water," Cutter said. "Her father carried debt. The land should be folded into my grazing lease until the child is placed somewhere proper." Mrs. Tully cleared her throat. "There's also the matter of the horse." Cutter glanced toward the window. "A dangerous beast seized on my land." Elsie finally raised her head. "He came because the fire scared him." Judge Peake avoided her eyes. "Do we have any family willing to take the child?" Silence. It spread through the room, sticky and ashamed. Women smoothed skirts. Men studied hat brims. Nobody wanted open trouble with Boone Cutter. Nobody wanted the cost of a child either. Cutter said mildly, "The state home in Cheyenne can arrange transport by Friday." Elsie's fingers tightened over the blanket. That was the only sign she gave. Nora looked around the room and saw exactly what the child saw. A dozen adults measuring inconvenience and calling it circumstance. "I'll take her," Nora said. The words came out before caution could stop them. Every face turned. Judge Peake blinked. "Mrs. Quinn, your place is small and your account with the bank. My place has a bed." Boone Cutter's gaze slid to her, curious now. "And your account with the bank does indeed deserve mention. In fact, Nora, the note on your ranch comes due Saturday at noon." She met his eyes. "I know the date. Then you also know I am under no obligation to extend it." He smiled the way a man smiled before closing a trap. "Unless, of course, we come to some agreeable understanding." There it was. Safety on one side, decency on the other. Nora could keep her head down, save the ranch if luck stayed kind, and let the little girl disappear into a brick building full of strangers. Or she could step into Boone Cutter's path with empty pockets and no guarantee of winning. Elsie looked at her then. Not pleading. Worse than pleading. Expecting nothing. That settled it. "I'll take her," Nora said again, "until the probate is settled. And the horse stays with the child's property until a proper ruling is made." Cutter laughed once under his breath. "You would gamble your ranch on a half-starved orphan and a black devil of a horse." "No," Nora said. "On what kind of woman I still intend to be." Judge Peake, relieved to let someone else carry the burden, pushed the papers forward. Nora signed. The nib scratched loud in the room. It sounded, to her, like a gate shutting behind a life she would not be returning to. Outside, Elsie stood beside the wagon while Mrs. Tully tied up a bundle of church house clothes for her. Nora reached for the blanket. The child held it tighter. "You can keep it," Nora said. A pause. Then, in a voice as thin as dry grass, Elsie said, "Thank you." It was not gratitude that caught Nora. It was surprise. Down in the stockyard, the Mustang slammed once against the rails until Elsie whistled low. He stopped at once. Boone Cutter came to Nora before she could climb into the wagon. "You should think carefully," he said. 3 weeks ago, Samuel Wren was stubborn too. Nora turned slowly. "Is that meant for advice?" "It's meant for memory." She climbed onto the wagon seat with Elsie beside her and did not look back. But all the way home across the sage flats, with cold wind needling through the boards and the child rigid beside her, one question kept moving through Nora's mind. If Cutter already owned the land and horse as cleanly as he claimed, why did he need the girl frightened enough to surrender them? The Quinn place sat in a fold of low hills with a creek that ran mean in spring and half thoughtful by autumn. The barn leaned east. The porch steps had been mended twice. Cottonwoods rattled at the back fence like old women gossiping. It was not much, but it was hers, or had been until grief and debt started carving pieces off it. Elsie climbed down from the wagon as if expecting to be sent somewhere else by sunset. Nora's hired hand, Gus Mercer, came out of the tack room wiping grease on a rag. He was 60 if a day, bow-legged from a life in saddles, with a mustache that looked permanently disappointed in the world. He saw the girl, saw the wagon bundle, saw Nora's face. "Ah," he said, "one of those days. One of those years," Nora answered. Gus nodded toward the ridge where the black Mustang had appeared behind them at a distance, tracking the wagon all the way from town without once letting himself be caught. That him? That's him. Gus spat into the dust. Lord preserve us. Nora gave Elsie the little room off the kitchen, not Rose's old room upstairs. She was not ready for that door. She set water to heat, put stew on the stove, and showed the child where the wash basin sat. Elsie moved carefully through every instruction, not from slowness, but from long practice and staying out of the way. At supper she ate too fast. Nora said nothing, only pushed the bread plate nearer. Later, long after Gus had gone to the bunkhouse and the lamps were turned low, Nora woke to the soft click of the back door. She took the shotgun from beside the bed and found Elsie on the porch in her stockings, the blanket around her shoulders, watching the dark yard. The Mustang stood beyond the fence, a black shape under the cottonwoods. Can't sleep? Nora asked. Elsie shook her head. Nightmares. A small pause. Worse when I do. Nora leaned against the porch post. The cold smelled of creek mud and frost-bitten sage. Somewhere an owl called once, twice. The Mustang stepped closer to the fence. Elsie reached through the slats and touched his nose. He came after the fire, she whispered. Wouldn't leave. Pa called him a half-wild fool before. Said he belonged more to the ridge than to any man. But after, she swallowed. After, he just stayed. What do you call him? Elsie looked surprised by the question. Mercy. Nora almost smiled. That a horse's name? It is if that's what he was. The answer sat between them like something old and true. For the next 3 days Nora worked harder than fear thought she could. She repaired fence, counted steers, and rode to town twice, trying to sell the last of the cream cows before the note came due. Everywhere Boone Cutter's shadow reached first. At the mercantile, old Mr. Red said quietly, He's telling folks you've taken on too much. At the feed store, a woman with a scar through one eyebrow pressed a sack of beans into Nora's wagon and muttered, No charge. For the child. At the pump behind the livery, 2 men went silent when Elsie approached with the pail, and silence could bruise just as hard as words. But the ranch itself began shifting in small ways. Elsie learned where Nora kept the blue crock for flour and how Gus liked his coffee black enough to stand a spoon in. She mended a torn grain sack without being asked. She found the old yellow cat under the porch and won him over with scraps in a single afternoon. And every evening she went to the hill pasture, where Mercy waited just outside arm's reach until she sat in the grass. Then, little by little, he came closer. Nora watched from the fence one sunset, as Elsie worked a burr out of the Mustang's mane. You've a way with him, she said. Elsie did not turn. Folks call a thing wild when it remembers what hurt it. That was the first line Nora carried in her bones. On Thursday, Boone Cutter came riding at noon with 2 men behind him. He did not dismount until he reached the porch, as if the whole yard were already his to inspect. I've reconsidered, he said. Sign over the Lower Creek pasture, return the child to county care, and I will forgive the note. Nora folded her arms. You're asking a great many favors for a man pretending generosity. I'm offering you survival. Then I suppose I'll have to try a harder kind. His gaze slid past her to Elsie, who stood by the kitchen door with flour on her sleeve. Your father kept papers, girl. Ledger papers. If you happened to find any among his things, I'd be willing to pay for them. Elsie's face went pale, only for a heartbeat. But Nora saw it. So did Cutter. There was at last the live wire under everything. Not the horse. Not even the land. Papers. What papers? Nora asked. Cutter smiled with no warmth in it. If Samuel Wren had been a wiser man, he would have learned that keeping records is only useful if one stays alive long enough to show them to someone. Gus took one step forward from the barn. Cutter's 2 riders shifted in their saddles. Nora said, Get off my porch. He did not move for a moment. Then he tipped his hat like a gentleman in a play and rode away. That night Nora checked the house twice, the barn once, and Cutter's threat 100 times in her mind. She found Elsie sitting on the kitchen floor by lamplight, staring at the brown blanket in her lap. Did your father hide papers? Nora asked softly. Elsie's fingers moved to one seam, then away again. He said if Mr. Cutter ever asked after this blanket, I was to say the fire got it. Nora knelt. Elsie, did Boone Cutter set that fire? The child's throat worked. Pa found things in the ranch books. Brands changed. Debts charged twice. Water sold that wasn't his. He said he was going to ride them to the circuit judge in Casper. She blinked hard. Cutter came that evening. After supper, Nora felt the kitchen tilt around her. What happened? Pa told Ma to take me through the shed. Elsie's voice went flat the way voices did when memory became too hot to hold barehanded. I was under the trough. I saw Mr. Cutter knock Pa down. I smelled lamp oil. Ma stitched the papers in the blanket while the men were outside shouting. She touched the seam again. She said if anything happened, keep mercy and keep moving. Nora sat back on her heels. Every choice she had made since the stockyard now stood before her in its full size. If the papers were real, Boone Cutter had motive for fraud, arson, and likely murder. If he knew Elsie still had them, the ranch had just become a target. And still there remained a coward's road. Hand the child to authorities, send the blanket elsewhere, claim ignorance, pray the storm hit someone else first. Nora looked at the little girl on the floor and knew she was done with coward's roads. Listen to me, she said. We bar the doors tonight. Tomorrow we take those papers to Judge Peak together. Elsie searched her face. Will he help? Nora thought of the courtroom, the bowed heads, the silence. I don't know. That was the truth. If you were in Nora's place, what would you do? Trust the law in a town owned by one man? Or bolt the door and keep the child close anyway? Tell me down in the comments, because this is where the heart of a person shows itself. The storm came before dawn, not weather. Men. Mercy screamed from the pasture first, a sound so fierce Nora was out of bed before it finished. She snatched the shotgun, shoved her feet into boots, and heard the barn door slam open below the wind. Gus shouted. A lantern shattered. Then flames licked orange up the side of the hayloft. Elsie, Nora yelled. The child was already in the hall, blanket in hand, face white in the dark. Back window, Nora said. Go to the spring house. Stay there till I come. Elsie shook her head. No. Now. That tone sent her running. Nora hit the yard at a dead sprint. Heat rolled off the barn. One of Cutter's men swung at Gus with a single tree. Gus went down to one knee but held fast to the man's coat with both hands. Cursing like revelation had finally found him. Another rider had Mercy roped at the neck, trying to drag him toward the gate. The Mustang came up savage and half-mad in the firelight, striking until sparks flew from the hard ground. Nora fired into the dirt beside the rider's horse. It reared. The rope dropped. Mercy broke free. Someone rushed her from the left. She swung the shotgun like an axe and felt would connect with bone. The man dropped. Then Boone Cutter stepped out of the smoke. Not on horseback now. On foot, hatless, jaw set, as if he had come to do something personal. Where is the blanket? He asked. Nora laughed once, breathless and furious. There it is. She pointed the barrel at him. For the first time since she had known his name, Boone Cutter looked less like power and more like appetite, plain, ugly, and startled by resistance. Behind him the barn roof groaned. Burning down my place won't save you, Nora said. It already has for years. He lunged. She fired high on instinct. The blast tore splinters off the gatepost near his shoulder. Cutter hit her hard around the waist. They went down in the mud and cinders together. She drove a knee up, rolled, and reached for the fallen gun. Gus slammed into Cutter from the side before she could. Get the girl. Gus shouted. Go. Nora did. She tore toward the spring house, smoke scraping her throat raw. Mercy flashed past her through the yard, loose and wild, then wheeled back when he saw her running. At the spring house door, she found Elsie not hiding but waiting, the blanket tied around her middle and a little leather packet clutched to her chest. The papers, Elsie gasped. Can he carry you? I don't know. There was no time left for not knowing. Nora whistled sharp. Mercy came. Not to her. To Elsie. The Mustang skidded to a stop in the ash-streaked yard, sides heaving, eyes white with fire. Elsie stepped forward, hand trembling once at her side. Mercy, she whispered. Please. Cutter's men were regrouping at the gate. One had Gus by the shoulders. Boone Cutter himself was limping toward them with murder in his face. Mercy lowered his head. Elsie grabbed mane and tried to climb, but fear made her foot slip. Nora shoved her upward with both hands. Again. The second time the child got halfway over. Mercy stood perfectly still. That one impossible Mercy, his stillness, saved them all. Elsie swung onto his back. Nora caught the mane beside her and vaulted up behind with more desperation than grace. Mercy launched forward before Cutter's men reached them. They cleared the north fence in a shower of rails and sparks. The ride through the dark was all cold air and terror. Sage slashed their legs. Creek water splashed black around Mercy's knees. Nora held Elsie with one arm and the blanket with the other, while the Mustang ran a path no ranch horse would have chosen, straight through cut banks and cedar shadows, into the broken country above Willow Draw. He did not stop until the ranch fire was a red smear far behind them. There, in an abandoned sheepherder's hut tucked against a sandstone rise, the three of them waited for dawn like fugitives in some old Bible story. Nora's shoulder burned where Cutter had driven her into the ground. Elsie's hands shook so badly she could not untie the blanket seam at first. Mercy stood in the doorway, head lowered against the wind, refusing to step far enough away for them to lose sight of him. Together they opened the seam. Papers slid into Nora's lap. Ledger sheets, copies of bills, a map of water rights, 2 signed notes showing Cutter had charged Samuel Wren and 3 neighboring ranchers for the same fencing lumber, and 1 statement in Samuel Wren's hand, naming Boone Cutter as the man who had threatened him over the records 3 days before the fire. The proof was ugly and plain. Elsie stared at the papers without crying. Pa said numbers tell on people if you let them sit still long enough. Nora looked at the child and saw not merely grief, but endurance. The kind that ought never to be demanded of someone that small. Outside, hoofbeats sounded on the ridge. Cutter had found them. Nora blew out the lamp. The next minutes moved sharp and fast. Men sliding down shale. A voice calling falsely sweet through the dark. Gus absent, fate unknown. The hut suddenly small enough for fear to fill wall to wall. Elsie, Nora whispered, if I make for the back cut, can you ride him alone? The child swallowed. If he lets me. Then you do not look back. Cutter's silhouette filled the doorway. You're finished, Nora. Mercy struck first. He came through the opening like black weather, slamming Cutter sideways into the stone jam, so hard the man's pistol flew out into the dirt. One of the others grabbed Nora's arm. She bit his wrist and drove her elbow into his throat. Elsie screamed. A shot cracked somewhere outside, then another. For one frozen second Nora thought they had lost. Then she heard Gus. Hold, you sons of devils. He came over the ridge in a farm wagon with 2 neighbors behind him, old Mrs. Tully standing in the bed with a lantern held high and a rake like a spear. Not law. Better. Witnesses. Cutter's second man broke first and ran for his horse. Cutter himself got one knee under him, blood down one cheek, and lunged for the dropped pistol. Mercy planted a hoof inches from his hand. Cutter stared up at the horse. The horse stared back. Neither moved. At last Cutter drew his hand away. By sunrise they had him tied to the wagon rail with his own reins. The quiet afterward felt stranger than the violence. Cold coffee on Nora's tongue. Wood smoke in the little hut. Gus binding her shoulder with a strip torn from his own shirt, while Elsie sat curled under the blanket with Mercy's muzzle resting in her lap. Nora touched the child's hair. You all right? Elsie nodded, then shook her head, then gave up pretending. I thought you'd send me off once it got hard. Nora's throat closed. When Rose died, she said slowly, I decided loving anybody that much again was just a different way of digging my own grave. I called it strength because that sounded finer than fear. Elsie stared at the floorboards. If people leave enough times, you start trying not to need staying. That was the line that broke Nora open clean through. She drew the child close. Hear me now? I am staying. Elsie leaned into her with all the caution of a creature who had been hurt for trusting before. Then, all at once, with the full weight of a child who had waited too long for one safe place to fall, Nora held her. Gus turned toward the doorway and pretended to be interested in the weather. If this part is moving you, then you are exactly who this story was meant for. A like and a subscribe tell us to keep bringing these nights to you. The danger was not gone. Cutter would deny. Judge Peak might fold. The town might still choose comfort over courage. But something had changed that could not be changed back. At first light, Mercy stepped away from the doorway and came to the threshold. Elsie rose. The Mustang bent one foreleg and lowered himself just enough. No trick. No command. A gift. He was letting her mount. Nora's breath caught. Elsie looked back once. He says we should go now. Nora would have smiled at that if the moment had not felt so holy. They reached Bitter Flats at noon with Nora walking, shoulder bandaged, Gus driving the wagon behind. and Elsie riding Mercy at the front like a small dark queen no one had bothered to see until it was too late to keep missing her. The town came out onto the boardwalks. Men left barbers, chairs half-shaven. Women stood in bakery doorways with flour on their hands. Children ran ahead shouting that the devil horse had taken a rider. Everybody looked. Nobody forgot. Boone Cutter, tied and filthy in Gus's wagon, lost half his power the instant people saw him lower than the child he had tried to crush. Inside the courthouse the air smelled of ink, wool, and reckoning. Judge Peak began nervously enough. But Mrs. Tully was there. So was Mr. Red from the Mercantile. So were two ranchers whose names appeared in Samuel Wren's ledger pages. One by one they stepped forward. Stolen calves. Falsified bills. Water sold twice. Threats made quietly in alleys and on porches. Truth moved through the room like fire through dry grass. Cutter tried laughter first. Then charm. Then outrage. It all sounded smaller under daylight. When the papers were read aloud, he lunged for them. Nora was ready. She moved before he finished deciding, caught his wrist, and shoved him back into the witness rail hard enough to splinter it. "You burned that family out," she said, voice carrying to every wall. Cutter bared his teeth. "Can the brat prove it?" Elsie answered from the courtroom door. "Yes." Every head turned. She sat on Mercy's bare back in the open doorway where light framed them both. She was not smiling. Her small hands were steady in the mane. "I saw you," she said. "I saw the oil can. I heard my pa tell you no. I heard you say a man should learn who owns the valley." Silence hit the room like a dropped beam. Cutter glanced around for help and found none. Not one person moved toward him. Judge Peak cleared his throat, and for once the sound came out like a judge's. "Boone Cutter, you will remain in custody pending charges of fraud, arson, extortion, and murder." Cutter spat at the floor. "You weak-bellied fool." Peak reddened. "And contempt." Sheriff Doyle, who had spent years being useful to the biggest wallet in any room, finally sensed the weather turning. He stepped behind Cutter with cuffs in hand. Mr. Red took the other arm before Cutter could jerk free. Gus stood up from the back bench and planted himself squarely in the aisle. Boone Cutter had spent a lifetime teaching small people to stand apart from one another. His ruin began when they stopped. He did not leave that courthouse with dignity. Nora was grateful for that. His accounts were seized by week's end. The bank examiner from Cheyenne found enough cooked ledgers to ruin 3 reputations and 1 fortune. Families he had cheated came forward with notes and receipts. The ranch on the ridge went to auction before the first snow. Mrs. Tully watched from the boardwalk and said, not softly, "About time." The good people inherited what fear had kept from them. Water rights were restored. False debts were struck. Samuel Wren's land, small as it was, came legally to Elsie under Nora's guardianship. Gus said seeing Cutter ride out in chains was better than Christmas, and he had loved exactly 2 Christmases in his whole life. As for Mercy, nobody tried to break him again. He belonged to Elsie because he had chosen to. Winter came, then passed. Nora opened Rose's old room in March and let sunlight into it for the first time in 12 years. She cried while changing the sheets and was not ashamed when Elsie found her there. By April, the girl's laughter came easier. By May, Gus had carved her a little wooden horse that looked more like a goat, and she loved it fiercely anyway. By June, Judge Peak signed the adoption papers with such solemnity one might have thought he was repairing the whole county by penstroke alone. Months later, on the first evening warm enough to leave the windows open, Elsie rode Mercy along the creek pasture while swallows dipped low over the water and the cottonwoods turned silver at their leaves. Home, Nora had learned, wasn't the first place that kept you. It was the place that stayed after keeping you got hard. She stood on the porch with Gus beside her and watched the little orphan girl nobody had valued enough, on the half-wild Mustang nobody could tame, moving through the gold light like a promise the world had almost failed to keep. Next time, we'll tell the story of the deaf ranch hand's daughter everybody pitted until the winter blizzard trapped her with the one-armed sheriff who was the only man in town humble enough to learn her language before asking for her heart.